The carriage wheels skidded over wet cobblestones as it raced out of London, and Clara Vance pressed her gloved hand against the rain-streaked window, watching the city that had rejected her disappear into the gloom. 3 seasons of humiliation, 3 seasons of whispered insults and turned backs, 3 seasons of being called the Copper Princess, the girl with a fortune but no bloodline. She was done with it. "Miss Clara, are you certain we can trust him?" Her lady's maid, Betsy, clutched the leather seat as the carriage lurched around a sharp corner. "Your father will tear London apart when he discovers what you've done." "My father," Clara said quietly, her breath fogging the cold glass, "has spent the past 24 years treating me like a shipment of ore to be auctioned off to the highest bidder." Betsy fell silent. They both knew it was true. Josiah Vance, the industrialist king of Cornwall, had never been a father. He had only ever been a merchant. When Clara's mother had succumbed to fever in the winter of 1845, Josiah had mourned for precisely 2 days. Then he had begun checking his ledgers. A daughter of marriageable age, intelligent but plain, possessed of a massive dowry but no title. A liability, certainly, but also an asset to be leveraged. If you love tales of passion and courage, please subscribe and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to know how far these stories travel. The iron gates of Ashbourne Hall shrieked in protest as the carriage passed through, a sound that echoed like a warning across the overgrown grounds. Clara peered out, expecting the grandeur befitting a dukedom, but what she saw made her breath hitch. The estate rose from the mist like the skeletal remains of a giant beast. Weeds choked the gravel drive, and the massive stone facade was darkened by years of soot and neglect. Ivy clawed at the walls, threatening to swallow the windows whole. It was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly ruined. Sebastian Thorne descended first, his boots crunching heavily on the loose stones. He offered a hand to assist her, his grip firm but impersonal, treating her with the same detached efficiency one might use to handle a loaded musket. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he said, the title falling from his lips with a distinct edge of bitterness. Clara stepped down, pulling her velvet cloak tighter against the damp chill that seemed to radiate from the stones themselves. Inside, the great hall was cavernous and cold, smelling faintly of wood smoke and old dust. A small line of servants waited, far fewer than a house of this size required. Their uniforms were clean but threadbare, mended so many times the stitching formed its own pattern. An elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Baines, dropped a curtsy that was respectful but guarded, her eyes darting to Clara's fine silk gown with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. It hit Clara then, a realization sharper than the winter wind. The War Duke wasn't just land rich and cash poor, he was destitute. She looked at the empty spaces on the walls where portraits had clearly been sold off, the scarcity of the candles fighting the encroaching gloom. He hadn't married her for greed. He had married her because he was starving. "Mrs. Baines will show you to the guest wing," Sebastian said abruptly, turning his back on the meagre welcome party. "It is the warmest part of the house. You'll have everything you need there." Clara watched him move toward the shadows of the staircase, his broad back a wall of tension. "And you, my lord?" she asked, her voice echoing too loudly in the emptiness. He paused, one hand gripping the banister, his knuckles white. "I keep to the west wing. It is better that way. You are here for safety and status, Clara, not for my company. I suggest you lock your door at night. The draughts in this old place can be unsettling." Without another glance, he ascended the stairs, disappearing into the dark heart of the house. Clara stood alone in the centre of the hall, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She had escaped her father's cage only to walk willingly into a tomb. 3 days of confinement in the guest wing was more than Clara could bear. She was a Vance, and Vances did not sit idly by, staring at peeling wallpaper while their investment crumbled. The house was quiet, the silence heavy and suffocating as she slipped out of her room and navigated the labyrinthine corridors toward the one room that might offer answers, the estate office. The room was freezing, the hearth cold and filled with ash, but the desk was a chaotic mountain of parchment. Clara approached it like a general surveying a battlefield. She picked up the heavy leather-bound ledger lying open in the centre. Her eyes scanned the columns of ink, black turning to red, page after page of debts, high-interest loans, and tenants unable to pay rent. It was worse than she imagined. The estate wasn't just poor, it was hemorrhaging. "Who gave you permission to be here?" The voice was a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Clara spun around. Sebastian stood in the doorway, filling the frame, his chest heaving as if he had run all the way from the stables. He was unshaven, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms, scarred by war, and his eyes were blazing with a terrifying fury. "I asked you a question," he snarled, stepping into the room. "What do you think you are doing?" "I am looking at a disaster," Clara said, her voice steady despite the rapid thrumming of her heart. She tapped the open page. "You're selling wool at prices from 5 years ago, and your steward is paying double for grain. You are being cheated, my lord." Sebastian crossed the room in 2 long strides and slammed the ledger shut, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. "My finances are none of your concern. I am your wife," Clara countered, holding his storm-grey gaze. "Your ruin is my ruin." "You are my wife on paper," he spat, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "Do not mistake this arrangement for a partnership, Clara. I married you for your dowry, not your opinion. Your father's gold will fix the roof and feed the tenants. You are here to be decorative and silent until the scandal blows over." Clara didn't flinch. She had faced down boardrooms of men who thought her mind was as soft as her skirts. "My father's gold is a finite resource, Sebastian. Once you spend it, it is gone. But my mind?" She reached past him, ignoring his flinch, and opened the ledger again to a specific entry. "I managed the Vance shipping logistics for 3 years. I know the current market rates. If you renegotiate these contracts, you save £400 by spring. If you ignore me out of pride, you lose it." Sebastian stared at her, his jaw working as he read the line she pointed to. The anger in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, cooling into a wary, grudging assessment. He looked from the numbers to Clara's determined face, realizing for the first time that the Copper King's daughter was made of steel. £400, he muttered, the fight draining out of him. "At least," Clara replied, smoothing her skirts. "Now, light the fire. If I am to save you from bankruptcy, I refuse to freeze while doing it." The sharp, rhythmic crack of wood splitting echoed through the misty morning air, drawing Clara away from her ledgers and out into the overgrown gardens. She followed the sound past the tangled rose bushes and the empty fountains until she reached the old stable yard. There, stripped to his waist despite the biting cold, was Sebastian. He was a force of nature, swinging a heavy axe with terrifying precision. Each strike was a release, a violent exorcism of demons she could not see. Sweat slicked his skin, making his muscles gleam in the pale winter light, but it was not his strength that made Clara stop in her tracks. It was the map of violence carved into his flesh. A jagged, silvery line ran from his left shoulder down across his ribs, disappearing into his waistband. Another puckered scar marred his back, a souvenir of shrapnel or a sabre. He paused, sensing eyes on him, and spun around, the axe gripped tight in his hand. When he saw her, his first instinct was not to cover himself, but to challenge her. He stood tall, chest heaving, thrusting his scars into the light as if daring her to scream or look away. "Enjoying the view, Duchess?" he asked, his voice rough with exertion and defiance. "Most ladies faint at the sight of what war actually looks like." Clara didn't faint. She didn't even blink. She walked slowly toward him, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. In London, men hid their flaws beneath padded coats and polite lies. Her father hid his cruelty behind a checkbook, but here was a man who wore his history on his skin. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, stopping a few feet away. Sebastian stiffened, waiting for the pity that always enraged him. "The cold makes it ache. The rest is just ugly." "It isn't ugly," Clara said, her gaze tracing the line of the scar on his shoulder. "It is evidence." He frowned, confused. "Evidence of what?" "That you survived," she said simply. "That you stood between something terrible and the rest of us, and you didn't break." She looked up, meeting his eyes with a frank, unblinking respect that unsettled him more than any scream could have. "My father has no scars, Sebastian. He lets other men bleed for his profits. You bled for your people." Sebastian's grip on the axe handle loosened. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the revulsion he was sure must be hiding behind her calm expression. He found none. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of his shame lightened just a fraction. "Go back inside, Clara," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He turned away, swinging the axe again, but the rhythm was slower now, less desperate. "Before you freeze to death out here with the monsters." "I see no monsters," she whispered to the wind, turning back toward the house. "Only a man." The storm hit 3 nights later, a howling gale that tore slates from the roof of the manor and brought a frantic pounding to the front doors at dawn. The village miller stood there, cap in hand, rain dripping from his nose. The river had surged, collapsing the bridge that connected the tenants' cottages to the market road. Without it, they couldn't move their winter stock. They would be cut off. Sebastian stood in the hall, his face grey with exhaustion. "I will write to the quarry in Derbyshire," he told the miller, his voice heavy with defeat. "But without ready coin they won't ship the stone for weeks. We will have to use the ford." "The ford is flooded, Your Grace," the miller said miserably. "The sheep will drown if we try to cross." Clara stepped out of the shadows, her ledger tucked under her arm. "We don't need Derbyshire stone," she announced, her voice cutting through the gloom, "and we certainly don't need to wait weeks." Sebastian turned to her, his patience fraying. "Clara, this is not a negotiation over wool prices. This is engineering." "This is logistics," she corrected, already pulling on her gloves. "Mr. Higgins, does the ironworks in Sheffield still owe the estate for the timber rights from 3 years ago?" The miller blinked. "Aye, my lady, but they claim they're short on cash." "We don't want cash," Clara said, a sharp glint in her eye. "We want slag iron and reinforced beams. They have a surplus sitting in their yard. I saw the inventory reports in London last month." She turned to Sebastian. "If we take the iron in lieu of payment, they clear their debt without spending a penny. We get the materials by tomorrow." Sebastian stared at her. "You want to build an iron bridge? Here?" "It's faster, stronger, and free," Clara said, buttoning her coat. "I'm going to the telegraph office in the village. I'll have the shipment on a train by noon." By the following afternoon, the village was a hive of activity. Clara stood in the mud, her fine hem ruined, directing the unloading of massive iron beams with the authority of a foreman. She spoke the language of the workers, haggling with the cart drivers and joking with the blacksmith. She didn't stand apart like a delicate flower. She was in the thick of it, her mind moving faster than the men could work. Sebastian watched from the ridge, feeling a strange dislocation. He had spent years trying to protect these people with his sword and his blood, failing them because his coffers were empty. Clara had saved them with a ledger and a ruthless understanding of trade. He saw the way the miller's wife brought her a cup of hot cider, the way the men tipped their caps, not out of obligation, but genuine gratitude. She wasn't just the Copper King's daughter anymore. Standing there in the mud, commanding a crew of rough men to save his village, she looked every inch a duchess. And for the first time Sebastian wondered if the estate didn't belong to him at all, but to the woman who knew how to save it. The peace of Ashbourne Hall shattered with the arrival of the post-rider. He brought a single letter sealed with heavy black wax, and the distinct, arrogant crest of Vance Mining and Industries. Clara's hands shook so violently as she broke the seal that she nearly tore the parchment. "Clara, I know you did not leave London alone. I have investigators in every county. If you are hiding with some fortune hunter, I will destroy him. If you return now, the Earl is still willing to overlook your indiscretion. You have 1 week before I involve the authorities." The words were not a plea, they were a hunting horn. Clara crumpled the letter, her face draining of colour. Sebastian plucked it from her trembling fingers, reading it in a single glance. His expression hardened, the War Duke masking the man. "He doesn't know where you are yet," Sebastian said, his voice low and dangerous. "But he's closing in." "He'll burn this place down to get me back," Clara whispered. "I should leave. If he finds me here—" "He will find you nowhere," Sebastian cut in. "You are my wife, my property under the law. Let him come." He crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fire, watching the threat turn to ash. "But we can take no chances. The guest wing is too exposed, too close to the servants' entrance. You're moving." "Moving where?" "To the west wing." The decree was absolute. Within the hour, Clara's belongings were transferred into the Lord's chambers, not his bed, but the adjoining sitting room, which he had hastily converted into a bedroom. The heavy oak door was bolted, and Sebastian began sleeping on the chaise in the main room, a loaded pistol resting on the side table. The isolation was immediate and intimate. They ate their meals on a small table by the fire, the rest of the house locked away. The silence that had once been a wall between them became a bridge. Over roasted pheasant and cheap wine, they stopped speaking of ledgers and bridges. "Why did you really leave?" Sebastian asked one night, the firelight casting long shadows across his scarred face. "Most women would kill for an earl." "The Earl beats his horses," Clara said quietly, staring into the flames, "and he laughs when they bleed. I knew that if I married him, eventually, I would be the horse." She looked up at Sebastian. "I would rather be poor and free than rich and broken." Sebastian looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You aren't poor, Clara, and I won't let you be broken." The air between them shifted, growing heavy with unspoken things. In the close quarters of the west wing, the scent of her lavender soap mixed with his wood smoke and leather. He was no longer just her protector. He was the only thing standing between her and the dark, and for the first time Clara didn't want to run. She wanted to stay right there in the firelight, beside the monster who kept the world at bay. The wind screamed against the stone walls of the west wing, a tempest that battered the glass and rattled the chimney. Snow piled high against the windows, sealing Ashbourne Hall into a white, silent tomb. Inside, the fire was the only living thing, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Sebastian poured another glass of whiskey. "I used to hate the quiet," he admitted, his voice rougher than usual. The storm had put him on edge. He paced the rug like a caged tiger. In the peninsula, quiet meant the enemy was waiting. It meant death was taking a breath. Clara sat curled in the oversized leather armchair, watching him. I hated the noise, she countered softly. My father's factories, the constant grinding of gears, the shouting, the steam whistles. It sounded like the world was eating itself. Silence was the only luxury he couldn't buy. Sebastian stopped pacing. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the heiress to the lonely girl who had hidden in the corners of a copper empire. He sat down on the ottoman before her, closer than he had ever dared to be. The heat from the fire flushed her cheeks, or perhaps it was the way he was looking at her, like a starving man looking at a feast he dared not touch. You should have had music, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips, and laughter, not gears and steam. And you should have had peace, Clara whispered. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the scar on his hand, before gently touching it. You kept us safe, Sebastian. Who kept you safe? No one, he rasped. There is no safety for men like me, Clara. We are the weapon, not the shield. You are my shield, she said, her voice trembling. The air in the room grew thin, charged with a sudden, electrifying tension. Sebastian's hand moved, covering hers, his grip warm and calloused. He leaned in, drawn by a gravity he couldn't fight. Clara's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She leaned toward him, her eyes fluttering shut, waiting, wanting. He was so close she could feel the heat of his skin, smell the whiskey and soap. His thumb brushed her lower lip, a touch so tender it made her ache. Then he froze. The fire popped, a sharp crack in the silence, and Sebastian flinched as if struck. He pulled back abruptly, standing up and putting the width of the room between them. His face was a mask of tortured restraint. Go to bed, Clara, he ordered, his voice harsh and strained. Lock the door. Sebastian. I am not a hero, he snarled, turning his back to her, gripping the mantelpiece until his knuckles turned white. I am the wreckage the war left behind. You deserve light, Clara. Don't ask me to drag you into the dark. Clara watched his rigid back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He wasn't rejecting her. He was protecting her from himself. And that, she realized as she retreated to the bedroom, was the most dangerous thing of all. The invitation could not be ignored. A local assembly, hosted by the sprawling, magnificently wealthy Viscount of Derby, was the centre of the county's social calendar. To refuse would be to invite questions. To hide was to admit guilt. Sebastian stood in the centre of Clara's room, watching as she fastened the last pearl button of her gown, a midnight blue silk that made her skin look like porcelain and her hair like spun gold. We stay for 1 hour, Sebastian instructed, adjusting his cravat. He looked every inch the Duke tonight, severe and striking in black formal wear, though the scar on his cheek seemed starker against the velvet. We dance once. We speak to the host, then we leave. If anyone asks, you are my distant cousin from the north. The assembly hall was a suffocating crush of perfume, candlelight, and gossip. Heads turned as they entered, the reclusive war duke and the unknown beauty on his arm. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wind through dry grass. Sebastian's hand tightened on Clara's waist, a silent promise of protection. Ignore them, he murmured against her hair. They are sheep, we are wolves. The music began, a waltz. Sebastian bowed, sweeping her onto the floor. For a moment the deception vanished. There was no father hunting them, no crumbling estate, no scars. There was only the firm pressure of his hand on her back, the heat of his body, and the dizzying spin of the dance. They moved in perfect synchronization, bound by the secret they shared and the attraction they denied. Clara looked up at him, breathless, and saw the guard drop from his eyes. He wasn't looking at her like a cousin or a business partner. He was looking at her like she was the only woman in the world. "You are beautiful, Clara," he said, the words torn from him. "Sebastian," she breathed, her heart soaring. Then the music stopped. As the applause scattered around them, a chillingly familiar voice cut through the noise. "Miss Vance, is it truly you?" Clara's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly. Standing near the punch bowl, holding a glass of sherry with a sneer of triumph, was Lord Lucian, the bankrupt earl her father had chosen for her. He looked older, crueler, his eyes darting from Clara to Sebastian with a predatory gleam. "I thought my eyes deceived me," the earl drawled, stepping closer, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the nearby matrons. "Your father is beside himself with worry. He believes you've been abducted." He looked at Sebastian, his smile sharp as a razor. "Or perhaps seduced?" Sebastian stepped in front of Clara, his body a wall of menace. "You are mistaken, sir. This is—" "Oh, come now, Ashbourne," the earl laughed, a cold, ugly sound. "We all know the Vance copper when we see it. Does her father know she is playing dress-up with a pauper duke?" The room went silent. The secret was out, hanging in the air like smoke. Sebastian's hand went to his side, where a sword would have been, his eyes promising violence. Clara gripped his arm, feeling the tremor of his rage. The dance was over. The war had begun. The carriage arrived at dawn, thundering up the drive of Ashbourne Hall like a hearse coming for a corpse. Clara stood at the window of the west wing, watching as her father stepped out. Josiah Vance looked exactly as she remembered, immaculate, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. Behind him were 2 constables and a solicitor clutching a sheaf of papers. The confrontation happened in the great hall. Sebastian stood at the base of the stairs, still dressed in his clothes from the night before, his face a mask of granite. Josiah Vance did not yell. He didn't need to. He simply laid the papers on the entry table. "Abduction," Josiah said, his voice echoing in the cold hall. "Fraud. Coercion of a vulnerable heiress. The magistrate has signed the warrant, Your Grace, unless, of course, my daughter returns with me immediately and we annul this farce." Sebastian looked at the papers, then at the constables shifting uncomfortably near the door. He knew the law. He knew that without Clara's trust fund he couldn't fight a man like Vance in court. He would be ruined, imprisoned, and his name dragged through the mud. He turned to the stairs where Clara stood, pale and trembling. "Go with him, Clara." "What?" She froze, gripping the banister. "The marriage was a mistake," Sebastian said, his voice flat and dead. "I cannot protect you from this. If you stay, you lose everything, your inheritance, your reputation, your freedom. Go back to London. Marry the Earl. Save yourself." "You coward," Clara whispered, descending the stairs slowly. "You think you are saving me. You are handing me back to the executioner." "I am setting you free," Sebastian roared, the cracks finally showing in his composure. "Look at this place, Clara. Look at me. I am a ruin. I have nothing to offer you but debt and ghosts. Go." He turned away, unable to look at her, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Clara reached the bottom of the stairs. She looked at her father, who held out a hand with a smug, victorious smile. Then she looked at Sebastian's back, the broad, scarred back that had shielded her from the wind, the storms, and the world. "No," she said clearly. Josiah's smile vanished. "Clara, get in the carriage." "I said no." Clara walked past her father, ignoring his outstretched hand, and stopped in front of Sebastian. She reached out and took his clenched fist in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You called me a partner, Sebastian. Partners do not abandon each other when the ledger turns red. She turned to her father, her chin lifted, eyes blazing with a fire that matched the Duke's own. "I am not a parcel to be traded, father. I am not a shipment of ore. I am the Duchess of Ashbourne, and I am home." Josiah Vance's face turned a mottled purple. "You foolish girl! You have no rights until you are 25. I am your guardian, and I say you are leaving. Constables, seize her." The constables hesitated, glancing between the angry merchant and the silent Duke. One took a step forward. That was the mistake. Sebastian moved. It was a blur of motion, violent and precise. In a heartbeat he had crossed the space between them, placing himself between Clara and the lawman. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He drew himself up to his full height, the scar on his face twisting as he snarled, radiating a terrifying, lethal aura that had once commanded battalions. "Touch her," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream, "and you will not leave this hall walking." The constables froze. This was not a bankrupt aristocrat. This was the Butcher of Badajoz, the War Duke. Sebastian turned his gaze on Josiah. "She is my wife, bound by law, by God, and by my blood. If you want her, Vance, you will have to kill me, and I promise you I will not die alone." The silence stretched, thin and brittle as glass. Josiah looked at the man who was ready to tear the world apart for his daughter, not for her money, but for her. He looked at the constables who were backing away, terrified. He realised with a bitter taste in his mouth that his money had finally met something it could not buy. Violence born of love. "Keep her then," Josiah spat, throwing the warrant on the floor. "She is disinherited, not a penny, Clara. You will starve in this ruin together." "We will manage," Clara said, slipping her hand into Sebastian's. "Get out of my house." 1 year later, the library of Ashbourne Hall was warm, the air scented with beeswax and old paper. Sunlight streamed through the clean, ivy-free windows, illuminating the new rugs and the polished mahogany desk where 2 heads were bent over a map. "The railway spur is approved," Clara said, tapping the parchment with a triumphant smile. "That means we can ship the slate directly to Manchester. The quarry profits will double by harvest." Sebastian leaned back in his chair, watching her. The lines of tension that had once defined his face were softer now, the shadows around his eyes chased away by a year of peace. He reached out, capturing her hand, his thumb tracing the ink stain on her finger. "You are brilliant," he murmured, "and terrifying." "Someone has to be," Clara teased, squeezing his hand, "since the War Duke has gone soft." "Soft?" Sebastian raised an eyebrow, a wicked glint in his eye. He pulled her out of her chair and into his lap, ignoring her laugh of protest. "I seem to recall you complaining about my stamina just this morning." Clara flushed, resting her forehead against his. "I wasn't complaining, I was negotiating." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of tea and promise. The scars on his body were still there, maps of a painful past, but they no longer hurt in the cold. The estate was flourishing, healed by her mind, and the Duke was whole, healed by her heart. "To the partnership," she whispered against his lips. "To the partnership," he agreed, "and to the storm that brought you home. A new story awaits you on the screen right now. Click it to discover another world of passion, heart, and unforgettable courage."